Henry Ford's own story, how a farmer boy rose to the power that goes with many millions, yet never lost touch with humanity. By Rose Wilder Lane. Foreword by Rose Wilder Lane. 52 years ago, July 30, 1863, a few farmers' families near Greenfield, Michigan, heard that there was another baby at the Fords, a boy. Mother and son were doing well. They were going to name the boy Henry. 26 years later, a little neighborhood on the edge of Detroit was amused to hear that the man Ford, who had just built the little white house on the corner, had a notion that he could invent something. He was always puttering away in the old shed back of the house. Sometimes he worked all night there. The neighbors saw the light burning through the cracks. 12 years ago, half a dozen men in Detroit were actually driving the Ford automobile about the streets. Ford had started a small factory, with a dozen mechanics, and was buying material. It was freely predicted that the venture would never come to much. Last year, January 1914, America was startled by an announcement from the Ford factory that $10 million would be divided among the 18,000 employees as their share of the company's profits. Henry Ford was a multimillionaire, and America regarded him with awe. Mankind must have its hero. The demand for him is more insistent than hunger, more inexorable than cold or fear. Before a race builds houses or prepares food with its hands, it creates in its mind that demigod, that Superman, standing on a higher plane than the rest of humanity, more admirable, more powerful than the others. We must have him as a symbol of something greater than ourselves, to keep alive in us that faith in life which is threatened by our own experience of living. He is at once our greatest solace and our worst enemy. We cling to him as a child clings to a guiding hand, unable to walk without it, and never able to walk alone until it is let go. Every advance of democracy destroys our old hero, and hastily we build up another. When science has exorcised Jove, and real estate promoters have subdivided the Olympian heights, we desert the old altars to kneel before thrones. When our kings have been cast down from their high places by our inconsistent struggles for liberty, we cannot leave those high places empty. We found a government on the bold declaration, "All men are born free and equal," but we do not believe it. Out of the material at hand we must create again our great ones. So, with the growth of big business during the last quarter of a century, we have built up the modern myth of the big business man. Our imaginations are intrigued by the spectacle of his rise from our ranks. Yesterday he was a farmer's son, an office boy, a peddler of Armenian laces. Today he is a demigod. Is our country threatened with financial ruin? At a midnight conference of his dependents, hastily called, he speaks one word. We are saved. Does a foreign nation, fighting for its life, ask our help? He endorses the loan. We contemplate him with awe. In one lifetime he has made himself a world power. In 20 years he has made $100 million, we say. He is a big business man. Our tendency was immediately to put Henry Ford in that class. He does not belong to it. He is not a big business man. He is a big man in business. It is not strange, with this belief of millions of persons, that the men who had been at the head of our great business development are greater than ordinary men, that most of them believe it themselves and act on that assumption. Henry Ford does not. His greatness lies in that. With millions piling upon millions in our hands, most of us would lose our viewpoint. He has kept his, a plain mechanic's outlook on life and human relations. He sees men all as parts of a great machine, in which every waste motion, every broken or inefficient part means a loss to the whole. "Money doesn't do me any good," he says. "I can't spend it on myself. Money has no value anyway. It is merely a transmitter, like electricity. I try to keep it moving as fast as I can, for the best interests of everybody concerned. A man can't afford to look out for himself at the expense of anyone else, because anything that hurts the other man is bound to hurt you in the end, the same way." The story of Henry Ford is the story of his coming to that conclusion, and of his building up an annual business of $150 million based upon it. End of foreword. Henry Ford's Own Story by Rose Wilder Lane. Chapter 1. One Summer's Day. It was a hot, sultry day in the last of July, one of those eastern summer days when the air presses heavily down on the stifling country fields, and in every farmyard the chickens scratch deep on the shady side of buildings, looking for cool earth to lie upon, panting. "This weather won't hold long," William Ford said that morning, giving the big bay a friendly slap and fastening the trace as she stepped over. "We'd better get the hay under cover before night." There was no sign of a cloud in the bright hot sky, but none of the hired men disputed him. William Ford was a good farmer, thrifty and weather-wise. Every field of his 300-acre farm was well cared for, yielding richly every year. His cattle were fat and sleek, his big red barns the best filled in the neighborhood. He was not the man to let 10 acres of good timothy and clover hay get caught in a summer shower and spoil. They put the big hay rack on the wagon, threw in the stone water jugs filled with cool water from the well near the kitchen door, and drove out to the meadow. One imagines them working there, lifting great forks full of the clover-scented hay, tossing them into the rack, where, on the rising mound, the youngest man was kept busy shifting and settling them with his fork. Grasshoppers whirred up from the windrows of the dried grass when they were disturbed, and quails called from the fence corners. Now and then the men stopped to wipe the sweat from their foreheads and to take long swallows from the water jugs hidden for coolness under a mound of hay. Then, with a look at the sky, they took up their forks. William Ford worked with the others, doing a good day's task with the best of them, and proud of it. He was the owner and they were the hired men, but on a Michigan farm the measure of a man is the part he takes in man's work. In the cities, where men work against men, let them build up artificial distinctions. On the farm the fight is against nature, and men stand shoulder to shoulder in it. A dark cloud was coming up in the northwest, and every man's muscles leaped to the need for getting in the hay. Suddenly they heard a clang from the great bell, hung high on a post in the home dooryard, and used only for calling in the men at dinner time or for some emergency alarm. Every man stopped. It was only 10 o'clock. Then they saw a fluttering apron at the barnyard gate, and William Ford dropped his fork. "I'll go. Get in the hay," he called back, already running over the stubble in long strides. The men stared a minute longer and then turned back to work, a little more slowly this time, with the boss gone. A few minutes later they stopped again to watch him riding out of the home yard and down the road, urging the little gray mare to a run. Going for Dock Hall, they surmised. They got in a few more loads of hay before the rain came, spattering in big drops on their straw hats and making a pleasant rustling on the thirsty meadows. Then they climbed into the half-filled rack and drove down to the big barn. They sat idly there in the dimness, watching through the wide doors the gray slant of the rain. The doctor had come. One of the men unhitched his horse and led it into a stall, while another pulled the light cart under the shed. Dinner time came and passed. There was no call from the house, and they did not go in. Once in a while they laughed nervously and remarked that it was a shame they did not save the last 3 loads of hay. Good hay, too, ran a full 4 tons to the acre. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon the rain changed to a light drizzle and the clouds broke. Later William Ford came out of the house and crossed the soppy yard. He was grinning a little. It was all right, he said. A boy. I believe they had up a jug of sweet cider from the cellar in honor of the occasion. I know that when they apologetically mentioned the spoiled hay, he laughed heartily and asked what they supposed he cared about the hay. "What are you going to call him, Ford?" one of the men asked him as they stood around the cider jug, wiping their lips on the backs of their hands. "The wife's named him already. Henry," he said. "Well, he'll have his share of one of the finest farms in Michigan one of these days," they said, and while William Ford said nothing he must have looked over his green rolling acres with a pardonable pride, reflecting that the new baby boy need never want for anything in reason. Henry was the second son of William Ford and Mary Lydigut Ford, his energetic, wholesome Holland Dutch wife. While he was still in pinafores, tumbling about the house or making daring excursions into the barnyard, the stronghold of the dreadful turkey gobbler, his sister Margaret was born, and Henry had barely been promoted to real trousers at the age of 4 when another brother arrived. 4 babies, to be bathed, clothed, taught, loved and guarded from all the childish disasters to be encountered about the farm, might well be thought enough to fill any woman's mind and hands, but there were 1,000 additional tasks for the mistress of that large household. There was milk to skim, butter and cheese to make, poultry and garden to be tended, patchwork quilts to sew, and later to fasten into the quilting frames and stitch by hand in herringbone or fan patterns. The hired hands must be fed, 20 or 30 of them at harvesting time. Pickles, jams, jellies, sweet cider, vinegar must be made and stored away on the cellar shelves. When the hogs were killed in the fall, there were sausages, head cheese, pickled pig's feet to prepare, hams and shoulders to be soaked in brine and smoked, onions, peppers, popcorn to be braided in long strips and hung in the attic, while every day bread, cake and pies must be baked, and the house kept in that apple pie order so dear to the pride of the Michigan farmers' womenfolk. All these tasks Mary Ford did, or superintended, efficiently, looking to the ways of her household with all the care and pride her husband had in managing the farm. She found time, too, to be neighborly, to visit her friends, care for one of them who fell ill, help anyone in the little community who needed it. And always she watched over the health and manners of the children. In this environment Henry grew. He was energetic, interested in everything from the first. His misadventures in conquering the turkey gobbler would fill a chapter. When he was a little older one of the hired men would put him on the back of a big farm horse and let him ride around the barnyard, or perhaps he was allowed to carry a spiced drink of vinegar and water to the men working in the harvest field. He learned every corner of the haymow, and had a serious interview with his father over the matters of sliding down the straw stacks. In the winters, wrapped in a knit muffler, with mittens of his mother's making on his hands, he played in the snow or spent whole afternoons sliding on the ice with his brothers. Best of all he liked the shop, where the blacksmith work for the farm was done and the sharpening of tools. When the weather was bad outside, his father or one of the men lighted the charcoal in the forge, and Henry might pull the bellows till the fire glowed and the iron buried in it shone white hot. Then the sparks flew from the anvil while the great hammer clanged on the metal, shaping it, and Henry begged to be allowed to try it himself, just once. In time he was given a small hammer of his own. So the years passed until Henry was 11 years old, and then a momentous event occurred, small enough in itself, but to this day one of the keenest memories of his childhood. End of Chapter 1. Henry Ford's Own Story, by Rose Wilder Lane. Chapter 2. Mending a Watch. This first memorable event of Henry Ford's childhood occurred on a Sunday in the spring of his 11th year. In that well-regulated household Sunday, as a matter of course, was a day of stiffly starched, dressed-up propriety for the children, and of custom-enforced idleness for the elders. In the morning the fat driving horses, brushed till their glossy coats shone in the sun, were hitched to the two-seated carriage, and the family drove to church. William and Mary Ford were Episcopalians, and Henry was reared in that faith, although both then and later he showed little enthusiasm for church-going. Sitting through the long service in the stuffy little church, uncomfortably conscious of his Sunday best garments, sternly forbidden to fidget, while outside were all the sights and sounds of a country spring, must have seemed a wanton waste of time to small Henry. To this day he has not greatly changed that opinion. "Religion, like everything else, is a thing that should be kept working," he says. "I see no use in spending a great deal of time learning about heaven and hell. In my opinion, a man makes his own heaven and hell, and carries it around with him. Both of them are states of mind. On this particular Sunday morning Henry was more than usually rebellious. It was the first week he had been allowed to leave off his shoes and stockings for the summer, and Henry had all a country boy's ardor for "going barefoot." To cramp his joyously liberated toes again into stuffy leather shoes seemed to him an outrage. He resented his white collar, too, and the immaculate little suit his mother cautioned him to keep clean. He was not sullen about it. He merely remarked frankly that he hated their old Sunday anyhow, and wished never to see another. Mother and father and the 4 children set out for church as usual. At the hitching posts, where William Ford tied the horses before going into the church, they met their neighbors, the Bennets. Will Bennet, a youngster about Henry's age, hailed him from the other carriage. "Hi, Hen, come here. I got something you ain't got." Henry scrambled out over the wheel and hurried to see what it might be. It was a watch, a real watch, as large and shiny as his father's. Henry looked at it with awed admiration, and then with envy. It was Will's own watch. His grandfather had given it to him. On a strict cross-your-heart promise to give it back, Henry was allowed to take it in his hands. Then he cheered up somewhat. "That ain't much," he scornfully remarked. "It ain't runnin'." At the same moment a dazzling idea occurred to him. He had always wanted to see the insides of a watch. "I bet I can fix it for you," he declared. A few minutes later, when Mary Ford looked for Henry, he was nowhere to be found. Will was also missing. When, after services, they had not appeared, the parents became worried. They searched. Inquiries and explorations failed to reveal the boys. They were in the Bennets' farm shop, busy with the watch. Having no screwdriver small enough, Henry made one by filing a shingle nail. Then he set to work and took out every screw in the mechanism. The works came out of the case, to the accompaniment of an agonized protest from Will. The cogs fell apart, the springs unwound. Altogether it was a beautiful disorder, enough to delight any small boy. "Now look what you've went and done!" cried Will, torn between natural emotion over the disaster to his watch and admiration of Henry's daring. "Well, you said you was going to put it together," he reminded that experimenter many times in the next few hours. Dinner time came, and Will, recalling the fried chicken, dumplings, puddings, cakes of the Sunday dinner, grew more than restless, but Henry held him there by the sheer force of his enthusiasm. The afternoon wore along, and he was still investigating those fascinating gears and springs. When at last outraged parental authority descended upon the boys, Henry's Sunday clothes were a wreck. His hands and face were grimy, but he had correctly replaced most of the screws, and he passionately declared that if they would only leave him alone, he would have the watch running in no time. Family discipline was strict in those days. Undoubtedly Henry was punished, but he does not recall that now. What he does remember vividly is the passion for investigating clocks and watches that followed. In a few months he had taken apart and put together every timepiece on the place, excepting only his father's watch. "Every clock in the house shuddered when it saw me coming," he says. But the knowledge he acquired was more than useful to him later, when at 16 he faced the problem of making his own living in Detroit. In those days farm life had no great appeal for him. There were plenty of chores to be done by an active boy of 12 on that farm, where every bit of energy was put to some useful purpose. He drove up the cows at night, kept the kitchen woodbox filled, helped to hitch and unhitch the horses, learned to milk, and chopped kindling. He recalls that his principal objection to such work was that it was always interrupting some interesting occupation he had discovered for himself in the shop. He liked to handle tools, to make something. The chores were an endless repetition of the same task, with no concrete object created. In the winter he went to the district school, walking 2 miles and back every day through the snow, and enjoying it. He did not care for school especially, although he got fair marks in his studies, and was given to helping other boys "get their problems." Arithmetic was easy for him. His mind was already developing its mechanical trend. "I always stood well with the teacher," he says with a twinkle. "I found things ran more smoothly that way." He was not the boy to create unnecessary friction in his human relations, finding it as wasteful of energy there as it would have been in any of the mechanical contrivances he made. He "got along pretty well with everyone" until the time came to fight, and then he fought, hard and quick. Under his leadership, for he was popular with the other boys, the Greenfield school saw strange things done. Henry liked to play as well as any boy, but somehow in his thrifty ancestry there had been developed a strong desire to have something to show for time spent. Swimming, skating, and the like were all very well until he had thoroughly learned them, but why keep on after that? Henry wanted to do something else then, and as for spending a whole afternoon batting a ball around, that seemed to him a foolish occupation. Accordingly, he constructed a working forge in the schoolyard, and he and his crowd spent every recess and noon during one autumn working at it. There, with the aid of a blowpipe, they melted every bottle and bit of broken glass they could find and recast them into strange shapes. It was Henry, too, who devised the plan of damming the creek that ran near the schoolhouse, and by organizing the other boys into regular gangs, with a sub-foreman for each, accomplished the task so thoroughly and quickly that he had flooded 2 acres of potatoes before an outraged farmer knew what was happening. But these occupations, absorbing enough for the time being, did not fill his imagination. Henry already dreamed of bigger things. He meant some day to be a locomotive engineer. When he saw the big black engines roaring across the Michigan farmlands under their plumes of smoke, and when he caught a glimpse of the sooty man in overalls at the throttle, he felt an ambitious longing. Some day. It was on the whole a busy, happy childhood, spent for the most part out of doors. Henry grew freckled, sunburned the skin from his nose and neck in the swimming pool, scratched his bare legs on blackberry briars. He learned how to drive horses, how to handle a hay fork or a hoe, how to sharpen and repair the farm tools. The shop was the most interesting part of the farm to him. It was there he invented and manufactured a device for opening and closing the farm gates without getting down from the wagon. Then, when he was 14, an event occurred which undoubtedly changed the course of his life. Mary Ford died. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. The First Job. When Mary Ford died, the heart of the home went with her. "The house was like a watch without a mainspring," her son says. William Ford did his best, but it must have been a pathetic attempt, that effort of the big, hard-working farmer to take a mother's place to the 4 children. For a time a married aunt came in and managed the household, but she was needed in her own home and soon went back to it. Then Margaret, Henry's youngest sister, took charge, and tried to keep the house in order and superintend the work of "hired girls" older than herself. She was capable, that good New England word so much more expressive than efficient, but no one could take Mary Ford's place in that home. There was now nothing to hold Henry on the farm. He had learned how to do the farm work, and the little attraction it had had for him was gone. Thereafter every task was merely a repetition. His father did not need his help. There were always the hired men. I suppose any need William Ford may have felt for the companionship of his second son was unexpressed. In matters of emotion the family is not demonstrative. The boy had exhausted the possibilities of the farm shop. His last work in it was the building of a small steam engine. For this, helped partly by pictures, partly by his boyish ingenuity, he made his own patterns, his own castings, did his own machine work. His material was bits of old iron, pieces of wagon tires, stray teeth from harrows, anything and everything from the scrap pile in the shop which he could utilize in any imaginable way. When the engine was finished, Henry mounted it on an improvised chassis which he had cut down from an old farm wagon, attached it by a direct drive to a wheel on one side, something like a locomotive connecting rod, and capped the whole with a whistle which could be heard for miles. When he had completed the job he looked at the result with some natural pride. Sitting at the throttle, tooting the ear-splitting whistle, he charged up and down the meadow lot at nearly 10 miles an hour, frightening every cow on the place. But after all his work, for some reason the engine did not please him long. Possibly the lack of enthusiasm with which it was received disappointed him. In the technical journals, which he read eagerly during his 16th winter, he learned about the big iron works of Detroit, saw pictures of machines he longed to handle. Early the next spring, when the snow had melted and every breeze that blew across the fields was an invitation to begin something new, Henry started to school as usual one morning and did not return. Detroit is only a few miles from Greenfield. Henry made the journey on the train that morning, and while his family supposed him at school, and the teacher was marking a matter-of-fact "absent" after his name, he had already set about his independent career. He had made several trips to Detroit in the past, but this time the city looked very different to him. It had worn a holiday appearance before, but now it seemed stern and busy, a little too busy, perhaps, to waste much attention on a country boy of 16 looking for a job. Nevertheless, he whistled cheerfully enough to himself and started briskly through the crowds. He knew what he wanted, and he was going straight for it. "I always knew I would get what I went after," he says. "I don't recall having any very great doubts or fears." At that time the shop of James Flower and Company, manufacturers of steam engines and steam engine appliances, was one of Detroit's largest factories. Over 100 men were employed there, and their output was one to be pointed to with pride by boastful citizens. Henry Ford's nerves, healthy and steady as they were, tingled with excitement when he entered the place. He had read of it, and had even seen a picture of it, but now he beheld for himself its size and the great number of machines and men. This was something big, he said to himself. After a moment he asked a man working near where he could find the foreman. "Over there, the big fellow in the red shirt," the man replied. Henry hurried over and asked for a job. The foreman looked at him and saw a slight, wiry country boy who wanted work. There was nothing remarkable about him, one supposes. The foreman did not perceive immediately, after one look into his steady eye, that this was no ordinary lad, as foremen so frequently do in fiction. Instead, he looked Henry over, asked him a question or two, remembered that a big order had just come in and he was short of hands. "Well, come to work tomorrow. I'll see what you can do," he said. "Pay you 2.5 a week." "All right, sir," Henry responded promptly, but the foreman had already turned his back and forgotten him. Henry, almost doubtful of his good fortune, hurried away before the foreman should change his mind. Outside in the sunshine he pushed his cap on the back of his head, thrust his hands deep into his pockets, jingling the silver in one of them, and walked down the street whistling. The world looked like a good place to him. No more farming for Henry Ford. He was a machinist now, with a job in the James Flower shops. Before him there unrolled a bright future. He was ambitious. He did not intend always to remain a mechanic. One day, when he had learned all there was to know about the making of steam engines, he intended to drive one himself. He would be a locomotive engineer, nothing less. Meantime, there were practical questions of food and shelter to consider immediately, and he was not the boy to waste time in speculations for the future when there was anything to be done. He counted his money, almost $4 and a prospect of 2.5 every week. Then he set out to find a boarding house. $2.50 a week, not a large living income, even in 1878. Henry walked a long time looking for a landlady who would consent to board a healthy 16-year-old mechanic for that sum. It was late that afternoon before he found one who, after some hesitation, agreed to do it. Then he looked at the small, dirty room she showed him, at her untidy, slatternly person, and decided that he would not live there. He came out into the street again. Henry was facing the big problem. How was he to live on an income too small? Apparently his mind went, with the precision of a machine, directly to the answer. When your reasonable expenses exceed your income, increase your income. Simple. He knew that after he had finished his day's work at the shops there would be a margin of several hours a day left to him. He would have to turn them into money. That was all. He returned to a clean boarding house he had visited earlier in the day, paid $3.50 in advance for 1 week's board, and ate a hearty supper. Then he went to bed. End of Chapter 3. Chapter 4. An Exacting Routine. Meantime, back in Greenfield, there was a flurry of excitement, and not a little worry. Henry did not return from school in time to help with the chores. When supper time came and went without his appearing, Margaret was sure some terrible accident had occurred. A hired man was sent to make inquiries. He returned with the news that Henry had not been in school. Then William Ford himself hitched up and drove about the neighborhood looking for the boy. With characteristic reserve and independence, Henry had taken no one into his confidence. But late that night his father returned with information that he had been seen taking the train for Detroit. William Ford knew his son. When he found that Henry had left of his own accord, he told Margaret dryly that the boy could take care of himself and there was nothing to worry about. However, after 2 days had gone by without any word from Henry, his father went up to Detroit to look for him. Those 2 days had been full of interest for Henry. He found that his hours in the machine shop were from 7 in the morning to 6 at night, with no idle moments in any of them. He helped at the forges, made castings, assembled parts. He was happy. There were no chores or school to interrupt his absorption in machinery. Every hour he learned something new about steam engines. When the closing whistle blew and the men dropped their tools, he was sorry to quit. Still, there was that extra dollar a week to be made somehow. As soon as he had finished supper the first night he hurried out to look for an evening job. It never occurred to him to work at anything other than machinery. He was a machine fan, just as some boys are baseball fans. He liked mechanical problems. A batting average never interested him, but "making things go," there was real fun in that. Machine shops were not open at night, but he recalled his experiments with the luckless family clock. He hunted up a jeweler and asked him for night work. Then he hunted up another and another. None of them needed an assistant. When the jewelers' shops closed that night he went back to his boarding house. He spent another day at work in the James Flower shops. He spent another night looking for work with the jeweler. The third day, late in the afternoon, his father found him. Knowing Henry's interests, William Ford had begun his search by inquiring for the boy in Detroit's machine shops. He spoke to the foreman and took Henry outside. There was an argument. William Ford, backed by the force of parental authority, declared sternly that the place for Henry was in school. Henry, with 2 days' experience in a real iron works, hotly declared that he'd never go back to school, not if he was licked for it. "What's the good of the old school, anyhow? I want to learn to make steam engines," he said. In the end William Ford saw the futility of argument. He must have been an unusually reasonable father for the time and place. It would have been a simple matter to lead Henry home by the ear and keep him there until he ran away again. And in 1878 most Michigan fathers in his situation would have done it. "Well, you know where your home is any time you want to come back to it," he said finally, and went back to the farm. Henry was now definitely on his own resources. With urgent need for that extra dollar a week weighing more heavily on his mind every day, he spent his evenings searching for night work. Before the time arrived to pay his second week's board, he had found a jeweler who was willing to pay him $2 a week for 4 hours' work every night. The arrangement left Henry with $1 a week for spending money. This was embarrassing riches. "I never did figure out how to spend the whole of that dollar," he says. "I really had no use for it. My board and lodging were paid, and the clothes I had were good enough for the shop. I never have known what to do with money after my expenses were paid. Can't squander it on myself without hurting myself, and nobody wants to do that. Money is the most useless thing in the world, anyhow." His life now settled into a routine eminently satisfactory to him, a routine that lasted for 9 months. From 7 in the morning to 6 at night in the machine shop, from 7 to 11 in the evening at work with a microscope, repairing and assembling watches, then home to bed for a good 6 hours' sleep, and back to work again. Day followed day, exactly alike, except that every one of them taught him something about machines, either steam engines or watches. He went to bed, rose, ate, worked on a regular schedule, following the same route, the shortest one, from the boarding house to the shops, to the jeweler's, back to the boarding house again. Before long he found that he could spend a part of his dollar profitably in buying technical journals, French, English, German magazines dealing with mechanics. He read these in his room after returning from the jeweler's. Few boys of 16 could endure a routine so exacting in its demands on strength and endurance without destroying their health. But Henry Ford had the one trait common to all men of achievement, an apparently inexhaustible energy. His active, out-of-door boyhood had stored up physical reserves of it. His one direct interest gave him his mental supply. He wanted to learn about machines. That was all he wanted. He was never distracted by other impulses or tastes. Recreation? No, I had no recreation. I didn't want it, he says. What's the value of recreation, anyhow? It's just waste time. I got my fun out of my work. He was obsessed by his one idea. In a few months he had mastered all the intricate details of building steam engines. The mammoth shop of James Flower and Company, with its great force of 100 mechanics, became familiar to him. It shrank from the huge proportions it had at first assumed in his eyes. He began to see imperfections in its system and to be annoyed by them. "See here," he said one day to the man who worked beside him. "Nothing's ever made twice alike in this place. We waste a lot of time and material assembling these engines. That piston rod'll have to be made over. It won't fit the cylinder." "Oh, well, I guess we do the best we can," the other man said. "It won't take long to fit it." It was the happy-go-lucky method of factories in the 70s. Men were shifted from job to job to suit the whim of the foreman or the exigencies of a rush order. Parts were cast, recast, filed down to fit other parts. Scrap iron accumulated in the corners of the shop. A piece of work was abandoned half finished in order to make up time on another order, delayed by some accident. By today's standards it was a veritable helter-skelter, from which the finished machines somehow emerged, at a fearful cost in wasted time and labor. When Henry was switched from one piece of work to another, taken from his job to help some other workman, or sent to get a needed tool that was missing, he knew that his time was being wasted. His thrifty instincts resented it. With his mind full of pictures of smoothly running, exactly adjusted machines, he knew there was something wrong with the way the iron works was managed. He was growing dissatisfied with his job. End of Chapter 4. Chapter 5. Getting the Machine Idea. When Henry had been with the James Flower Company 9 months, his wages were increased. He received $3 a week. He was not greatly impressed. He had not been working for the money. He wanted to learn more about machines. As far as he was concerned, the advantages of the iron works were nearly exhausted. He had had in turn nearly every job in the place, which had been a good education for him, but the methods which had allowed it annoyed him more every day. He began to think the foreman rather a stupid fellow, with slipshod, inefficient ideas. As a matter of fact, the shop was a very good one for those days. It turned out good machines, and did it with no more waste than was customary. Efficiency experts, waste motion experiments, mass production, in a word, the machine idea applied to human beings was unheard of then. Henry knew there was something wrong. He did not like to work there any longer. 2 weeks after the additional 50 cents had been added to his pay envelope, he left the James Flour Company. He had got a job with the Dry Dock Engine Works, manufacturers of marine machinery. His pay was $2.50 a week. To the few men who knew him he probably seemed a discontented boy who did not know when he was well off. If any of them took the trouble to advise him, they probably said he would do better to stay with a good thing while he had it than to change around aimlessly. He was far from being a boy who needed that advice. Without knowing it, he had found the one thing he was to follow all his life. Not machines merely, but the machine idea. He went to work for the Dry Dock Company because he liked its organization. By this time he was a little more than 17 years old, an active, wiry young man, his muscles hard and his hands calloused from work. After nearly a year of complete absorption in mechanical problems, his natural liking for human companionship began to assert itself. At the Dry Dock Works he found a group of young men like himself, hard-working, fun-loving young mechanics. In a few weeks he was popular with them. They were a clean, energetic lot, clear-thinking and ambitious, as most mechanics are. After the day's work was finished, they rushed through the wide doors into the street, with a whoop of delight in the outdoor air, jostling each other, playing practical jokes, enjoying a little rough horseplay among themselves. In the evenings they wandered about the streets in couples, arms carelessly thrown over each other's shoulders, commenting on things they saw. They learned every inch of the waterfront, tried each other out in wrestling and boxing. Eager young fellows, grasping at life with both hands, wanting all of it and wanting it right then. Naturally enough they smoked, drank, experimented with love-making, turned night into day in a joyous carouse now and then. But before long Henry Ford was a leader among them, as he had been among the boys in the Greenfield school, and again he diverted the energy of his followers into his own channels. Pursuits that had interested them seemed to him a waste of time and strength. He did not smoke. His tentative attempt with hay cigarettes in his boyhood had discouraged that permanently. He did not drink, and girls seemed to him unutterably stupid. "I have never tasted liquor in my life," he says. "I'd as soon think of taking any other poison." Undoubtedly his opinion is right, but one is inclined to doubt the accuracy of his memory. In those early days in Detroit he must have experimented at least once with the effects of liquor on the human system. Probably once would have been sufficient. Besides, about that time he developed an interest so strong that it not only absorbed his own attention, but carried that of his friends along with it. He bought a watch. It had taken him only a few months to master his task in the Dry Dock Works so thoroughly that his wages were raised. Later they were raised again. Then he was getting $5 a week, more than enough to pay his expenses without night work. He left the jeweler's shop, but he brought with him a watch, the first he had ever owned. Immediately he took it to pieces. When its scattered parts lay on a table before him he looked at them and marveled. He had paid $3 for the watch, and he could not figure out any reason why it should have cost so much. "It ran," he says. "It had some kind of a dark composition case, and it weighed a good deal, and it went along all right, never lost or gained more than a certain amount in any given day. But there wasn't anything about that watch that should have cost $3. Nothing but a lot of plain parts made out of cheap metal. I could have made one like it for $1 or even less. But it cost me $3. The only way I could figure it out was that there was a lot of waste somewhere." Then he remembered the methods of production at the James Flour Company. He reasoned that probably that watch factory had turned out only a few hundred of that design, and then tried something else, alarm clocks perhaps. The parts had been made by the dozen, some of them had probably been filed down by hand to make them fit. Then he got the great idea. A factory, a gigantic factory, running with the precision of a machine, turning out watches by the thousands and tens of thousands, watches all exactly alike, every part cut by an exact die. He talked it over with the boys at the Dry Dock Works. He was enthusiastic. He showed them that a watch could be made for less than $50 by his plan. He juggled figures of thousands of dollars as though they were pennies. The size of the sums did not stagger him, because money was never concrete to him. It was merely rows of figures. but to the young fellows who listened his talk was dazzling. They joined enthusiastically in the scheme. Then their evenings became merely so much time to spend up in Ford's room, figuring estimates and discussing plans. The watch could be made for 37 cents, provided machinery turned it out by tens of thousands. Henry Ford visualized the factory, a factory devoted to one thing, the making of one watch, specialized, concentrated, with no waste energy. Those eager young men planned the whole thing from furnaces to assembling rooms. They figured the cost of material by the 100 tons, estimated the exact proportions each metal required. They planned an output of 2,000 watches daily as the point at which cost of production would be cheapest. They would sell the watch for 50 cents and guarantee it for 1 year. 2,000 watches at a profit of 13 cents each. $260 daily profit. They were dazzled. "We needn't stop there. We can increase that output when we get started," Henry Ford declared. "Organization will do it. Lack of organization keeps prices up, for its cost must be charged in on the selling price, and high prices keep sales down. We will work it the other way. Low prices, increased sales, increased output, lower prices. It works in a circle. Listen to this." He held them, listening, while he talked and figured, eliminating waste here and cutting expenses there, until the landlady came up and knocked at the door, asking if they meant to stay up all night. It took time to get his ideas translated into concrete, exact figures. He worked over them for nearly a year, holding the enthusiasm of his friends at fever heat all that time. Finally he made drawings for the machines he planned and cut dies for making the different parts of the watch. His plan was complete. A gigantic machine, taking in bars of steel at one end and turning out completed watches at the other. Hundreds of thousands of cheap watches, all alike. The Ford watch. "I tell you there's a fortune in it, a fortune!" the young fellows in the scheme exclaimed to each other. "All we need now is the capital," Ford decided at last. He was turning his mind to the problem of getting it when he received a letter from his sister Margaret. His father had been injured in an accident. His older brother was ill. Couldn't he come home for a while? They needed him. End of chapter 5.